You have to have visionaries, you have to have people that will think outside of the norm.
We have to be given the power to tell our own stories.
We all want to say our piece. This is a crazy time.
What they care about is what it means to them.
You have to not think like society thinks.
This is a fight about power. Who has it and who has the right to use it?
We're having a reckoning about what public safety can, should, and must look like.
It's about a broader question of representation and who gets to create the images and define how we see the world.
They want their voice to be heard, they have to get involved.
Finally, we get to tell our truth and tell our stories like our stories matter.
What's going to bring people together is equality.
The love that we have for each other is the shortcut to true human happiness.
You start to see how it's all connected.
Every single person around the world can create a movement.
Hello, everyone. I'm Candace Montgomery, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Atlantic Live. And welcome to our ongoing series, The Atlantic's Progress Report, Advancing Equity in America. We are so glad you could join us today. Let's jump right in. The coronavirus pandemic fundamentally disrupted every aspect of American life as we know it. 2 years after the beginning of a once-in-a-generation pandemic, an economic downturn, racial justice uprisings, and reform proposals, how far have we moved the needle in equity in this country? This afternoon, through a series of conversations, we will measure the intent versus the impact of the proposals to address systemic inequities for marginalized communities, and will outline the additional efforts needed to create a more equitable America. There's a lot to talk about, but before we dive in, I want to thank our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, for their support of the Atlantic's journalism today. I also want to remind all of you at home that you can participate in the conversation via the Q&A tab. Please tell us where you're from, and if you ask a question for our speakers, we can incorporate it into the conversation. Now, let's get started.
For our first conversation, we're exploring equity in supporting small businesses. Please welcome Natalie Madeira Cofield, Assistant Administrator for the Office of Women's Business Ownership, U.S. Small Business Administration. Fabrice E. Coles, Senior Manager, Global Public Policy, PayPal. Luz Urrutia, CEO, Action Opportunity Fund. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer, Annie Lowry.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I want to go ahead and jump right into our conversation about small business ownership, particularly among women and racial minority groups. So where are we right now? We have an economy that in some ways is running very, very hot with low unemployment and some continued supply chain issues. But on the other side, we have rising interest rates, concerns about inflation. And so, Luz, I was hoping that we could start with you just to tell us 2 years into this pandemic, give us a sense of how we're doing in terms of small business formation.
Sure. Well, good morning, and thank you for this opportunity. I think we all know that the last 2 years wreaked havoc on existing small businesses, especially those owned by women, immigrants, and people of color. But many new businesses now have sprung from the crisis. You know, the Kauffman Foundation just did some research that talks that the rate of new entrepreneurs was higher in both 2020 and 2021 than in the pre-pandemic 2019. And last summer, the number of self-employed Americans reached its highest point since the 2008 financial crisis. So individuals who lost jobs or were dissatisfied with opportunities in the labor market have increasingly turned to entrepreneurship. The pandemic has also spurred many entrepreneurs to go digitally, which has been great. In 2020, 2.8 million more online micro businesses were created versus 2019. And not surprising, they were primarily women who led this growth, as many urgently needed to have flexible hours to contend with childcare responsibilities. You know, starting an online micro business has also been growing in popularity with Black entrepreneurs, where communities were hit disproportionately hard by the pandemic. The great news here is that these trends are reversing a decades-long decline in American entrepreneurship. But more importantly, America's new entrepreneurs are increasingly diverse. So between 1996 and 2020, the share of new Latin, Asian American, Black entrepreneurs has more than doubled. And the share of Black entrepreneurs has also increased substantially by about 56%, while the share of new white entrepreneurs has declined by almost 30%. You know, small business is a proven path to building household wealth and financial security. So when you look at home-owned businesses or businesses that are owned in households, they earn more than twice the wealth of their wage-earning peers. And this impact is even more pronounced for businesses that are owned by people of color. So 2 years after the start of the pandemic, we say that small businesses remain the heroes of our economy. But as you said, in 2022, you know, the inflation, labor market challenges, supply chain constraints are hitting them very hard. And it really could be disastrous for these small businesses unless they can adapt.
Great. So, Natalie, I'd like to go to you to talk about how the government is addressing equity concerns as we're seeing, as we've noted, this flush of new businesses, including among women, including among Black, Latino, Asian entrepreneurs. So what's the role of the government in ensuring equity and supporting the growth of those businesses?
Sure. And thank you all so much for having me. So a couple of things. One, right now I serve as the assistant administrator at the SBA, leading the Office of Women's Business Ownership. And this is particularly important because, as you just heard, women are the fastest growing entrepreneurial segment in the country. Our office was recently elevated by Administrator Isabella Guzman to report directly to the administrator. We've also, over the course of the last year since I've been appointed, expanded the Women's Business Center network to include more than 26 new women's business centers. And now we have a women's business center in every state in the United States of America. We also, over the course of this last year, deployed more than $70 million in funds direct to nonprofit organizations that support ecosystems for women entrepreneurs. And that's just what's happening from my office. On the president's first day in office, he signed an executive order which was around equity. And what it did was force and ask all federal agencies to look and evaluate at the way that they're engaging communities across the country, how we are providing services, and how we're delivering and supporting communities across the board. And that includes everything from underrepresented, urban communities, rural communities, tribal lands. And I've been proud to chair that work at the Small Business Administration, where we recently just released the first ever equity report for SBA, which includes a number of actionable items that are happening across our portfolio, as well as across other federal agencies. And that's something that will be announced this week in conjunction with Susan Rice. So that is something that's happening. Then we also changed when this administration came into office, we changed the way in which disaster recovery funds were made more readily available to the smallest of small businesses across the country. We all know that the first round of PPP did not necessarily touch the smallest of small businesses, and certainly not those in underrepresented communities across the country. And when the Biden-Harris administration came into office, one of the things that we changed was the time frame for which we provided smaller businesses the ability to be eligible to apply, going through CDFIs, which we know are the primary financing vehicles for small businesses across the country. We also allowed for opening the doors for those who are not with a traditional Social Security number in the United States of America, but do have a tax identification number for their small business. And we also reduced the requirement that you had to have no delinquency on student debt. And we all know that those also impact the lower income, urban, rural, and underrepresented communities most in terms of their ability to make debt repayments, particularly during the pandemic. And then what we saw was nearly 96% of PPP funds during that time went to businesses with 20 or fewer employees. We also deployed nearly $450 billion through PPP, restaurant revitalization, which included a grace period for women, veteran, rural, and underrepresented communities to be able to submit their applications, and deployed $16.8 billion to support restaurants across the country, which is in the service industry, and we know is also represented and reflected both by communities of color in workers, but also in communities of color in ownership, as well as shuttered venues. So, in listening to what it's taking to build back, I know that the SBA has been on the front line of this recovery, and part of the American Rescue Plan included the deployment of $100 million to support nonprofit organizations and state governments across the country with providing culturally competent technical assistance and business advisory services so that we never have to go through a circumstance again where folks are not aware of programs and their eligibility to go for these initiatives.
Wonderful. And so, Fabrice, I'd like to go to you, and I'd specifically like to talk about the use of new app and web-based financial products and their role in supporting new small business owners. So we have seen, I think, traditional bricks and mortar obviously being really important in providing loan financing for new businesses, but it seems like there's been a shift to newer products that are perhaps reaching a new audience of entrepreneurs, but also there's some risk of them not coming with the same safeguards as traditional banking products. So I was hoping that you could speak to that and financial inclusion and perhaps how new financial products might be working in that space.
Great. Thank you so much. Great to be with you today. And, as you all know, PayPal is really committed to improving financial health of consumers and small businesses. We're a two-sided network. That's kind of our secret sauce. And so, inclusion broadly for both sets of customers is terribly important. And so, as you indicated, we kind of look at our products as a means to, really pursue this effort and allow us to implement our mission, vision, and values, which is about democratizing financial services access for everyone. And so how do you do that? We believe that to get there, it's about an open, accessible, inclusive financial system where everyone can really participate and have full control over their financial health. And we kind of have to look even beyond the notion of just creating access and really talk about breaking down the barriers that really prevent people from participating and thriving. And so you mentioned new kind of products. We think that does kind of go into our business model and allow us to better serve our small businesses, in a really powerful way. And democratizing that access is really how we get there. And the products that you mentioned, are offered, in conjunction with bank partners, and so there is that safety and security to those products on offer, and they are providing access to those that may have challenges accessing those products from other institutions. And so PayPal is very proud of its product suites, especially during the pandemic. PayPal was really able to step up on the product side, on the investment side, on the partnership side, to really invest in our SMEs to ensure that they have what they need to keep their doors open. We invested $535 million in racial equity efforts, and a big component of that was focused on SME growth during a very challenging time, which for many, especially minority business owners, continues. And so what I can say is that, our platform is really aimed at providing a suite of offerings so that more people can really dig deep and access those and contribute to our economic recovery.
Great. So I just want to take a moment to remind everybody at home that you can participate in this conversation via the Q&A tab. So if you could tell us where you're from, ask a question for one of our speakers. If we get questions, then I can incorporate them into the conversation towards the end of the conversation. And so I want to go back at this point to something, Luz, that you had mentioned, which is this great flush of new businesses that occurred during a downturn, even if the recovery was quite quick, during a very unusual and chaotic time in the economy. And so I'm wondering if you could identify what was it about that period of time or this period of time that, despite all of the difficulties that people facing, health challenges, school closures, issues with some local economies collapsing, that led still to so many entrepreneurs seeing some opportunity in this moment, with an eye to thinking of how we could support that in the future.
Sure. So, I think we saw this and we see it after every major economic downturn. We saw it in the Great Recession. We saw it in previous crises before that. And it's primarily women and entrepreneurs of color that really come out to establish new businesses and rebuild the economy. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the biggest reasons for women is that, we call it, this was the she session, right? Because a lot of women either lost their jobs or had to leave their jobs because they had responsibilities at home to take care of children, take care of parents or, family members. And so they still needed to have income. And so starting a new business from home has become sort of the norm. And again, we've seen this at every crisis, right? The other part is when people find themselves with no jobs, or they are dissatisfied with the jobs that they currently have, they generally look to entrepreneurship to fill that gap. I will say that from our experience, entrepreneurship is not something that one wakes up one day and says, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I've never thought about it. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. What happens is these individuals have it in their DNA to want to have their own business, to do something for themselves, because they do believe that it gives them more flexibility, that, entrepreneurship is second next to home ownership to building wealth. And so when they have an opportunity, whether it's, intentional or unintentional, what happened in the pandemic, that so many folks lost their jobs, they turn to, this is the opportunity, right? And we know a lot of folks were able to get some of the funding and the savings that they had to launch these new businesses. We, in our Acción Opportunity Fund, we provide responsible loans to entrepreneurs that are looking to grow and thrive in their businesses. And we've seen that the potential and the number of new business owners that are coming, asking for business advising, coaching, technical assistance, and capital is tremendous. And so it is our responsibility to, Fabrice's point, that we develop products and solutions that are going to help these entrepreneurs thrive and grow with their businesses, help support their families, build towns into neighborhoods, and grow their communities.
Great. So Fabrice, I'd love to go to you about, obviously the Great Recession. One of the things that kicked it off in the global financial crisis was this tremendous tightening of financial conditions. We really saw credit markets shut down. And it seems that for all that this pandemic caused a very violent recession, that didn't quite happen, and that a lot of the problems with accessing capital had to do with pandemic health restrictions. So I'm wondering if that sounds correct to you, and what was going on here in terms of the challenges of getting credit out to individuals, entrepreneurs, small businesses, again, given that this was and remains an unusual time given the global health challenge that we're facing.
Thank you for that important question. There really was a lot of challenges in accessing, but I think that, what was really good to see was that industry and government worked together to address those issues. And I think that's an important lesson for us, and I think an important lesson for the country, is that, for big problems like this, industry and government can work together to provide solutions. And as you referenced earlier, it was a challenging time. There were snafus and hiccups, but, PayPal, along with, again, other industry players in partnership with federal, state, local governments, and the nonprofit sector really worked with entrepreneurs to ensure that that capital could flow. And it was far, far, far too slow in especially Black and Brown communities at the very height of the global pandemic. And Natalie referenced, the associate administrator referenced the programming there to open up the spigot a bit more for those entrepreneurs who had been left behind. But let's take a step back for a moment, and let's talk about Black and Brown communities. We know full well that these issues, they're not germane to the pandemic. These issues predate the pandemic in Black and Brown communities in terms of access to capital, and restoring those communities and their access is not going to be an overnight deal. And so again, that's why I want to emphasize for the audience at home, the importance of ecosystems. PayPal, along with other partners, again, federal, state, and local governments, nonprofit sector, other businesses, other financial institutions, all had a role to play to ensure that access was provided. And we saw some very good things come out of that. We saw people keep their doors open. We saw people expand some payrolls in some instances. But what really matters is that there were intentional actions taken by all the different sectors of our economy to really step into the breach. And I think that's one of the enduring lessons of this moment, is that with some intentionality, a lot can get done. Not perfectly, but certainly a big investment in moving forward and sustaining progress. And I think that's what we really need to remember out of this moment. The challenges endure. We have a lot more work to be done. Problems have not been eliminated. They have been mitigated. And we have to lean in even further with an ecosystem approach, because no person, no entity can do it alone. We really have to focus on lifting up these communities together. And I think that for PayPal is one of the enduring lessons here.
Got it. So Natalie, I'd like to go to you, and something that you and our other guests have gestured to was that in this initial wave of PPP loans, the entrepreneurs or the small businesses who had pre-existing relationships with banks were often first in line, and that led to some equity issues. In the second and later rounds of funds, there was more money for community lenders, so CDFIs and others, and there was more participation of Black entrepreneurs, Latino women. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to me about the lessons that you might draw from that, both in terms of crisis response, but more importantly, going forward.
Yeah, so a couple of things to put this into perspective. SBA, prior to the pandemic, went from serving roughly 50,000 customers through our financial products, our Office of Capital Access, through 5,000 intermediary financial institutions, to during at the height of the pandemic, serving 11 million small businesses with various financial products that I mentioned, from PPP funding through our institutional partners to direct funding through restaurant revitalization and through shuttered grant programs, and through our COVID EIDL program, which I would also like to mention that this administration and the administrator has doubled the amount of money that entrepreneurs have access to through the COVID fund. So typically when you went for COVID funding, you would receive at maximum $500,000. Now it is $2 million. Which is a considerable increase in terms of the access to capital that entrepreneurs have access to. Now, again, scale of this size with a private sector business would be dubious. Scale of this size with a government agency is also the same. And so we have not gotten everything right at SBA. We understand that. But we also know that, we have exponentially increased the number of businesses that we are working with on a daily basis. And we're working with them in new ways that we've never worked with them before. SBA has never been a direct funder to small businesses, and suddenly overnight we became one. There was no intermediary between the Small Business Administration and small businesses across America's Main Street for restaurants and for shuttered. It was our program. Now, what we've learned from this is, to Fabrice's point and to others, to Luce's points as well, we have the infrastructure now. We've built the muscle over the last 2.5 years of learning not only about the type of programs that we can have or that we do have currently, but also the technology that SBA needs to continue to invest in for us to be able to meet the growing demands of small businesses across the country. Lender Match is also a platform that the administrator has recently relaunched, which helps small businesses find lenders in their community. These are things that, again, whether you can physically walk into one of our more than 1,000 centers across the country, or you go online to get access to the resources of the Small Business Administration and our national network of resource partners, these should be available readily to you in a digital format. And this is also something that I think the government also had to learn. And SBA being the economic forerunner for recovery during this time also has been at the forefront of this. I want to say one other thing about ecosystems. I mentioned the $100 million Community Navigator program, and that was a direct investment into ecosystems across the country. And the way that program was designed, which I was very involved in, was a hub and spoke model where the SBA funded organizations, and those organizations partnered with and funded smaller organizations throughout their nodes and networks to ensure that we were touching and continuing to touch various communities. But by default, we were investing in ecosystem establishment in communities across the country. Because when we look 5 years from now at where we've come with this pandemic, we want to be able to also say that the ecosystem was fortified, just as small businesses were, because we also know small business service providers were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic as well, and they struggled with their ability to meet the growing demand that they had on how to engage with small businesses during that time.
Wonderful. So I'm going to go to a question from the audience. I wish that we had more time to discuss this. I feel like we could be here all day. But this question is from Tina. And she says, I'm curious what else, aside from access to financial capital, we can be doing to support women entrepreneurs, Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latino entrepreneurs. And so it's obviously a broad question. But yeah, Natalie, go ahead, please.
Sure. So I want to share a couple of things that are happening right now. Number one, the federal contracting spend with small disadvantaged businesses. The president made an announcement in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Black Wall Street to increase federal spend to 15% with small disadvantaged businesses. That's something that the SBA is directly working with. As a result, the SBA has been working intentionally on debundling large contracting opportunities, and has also added 700 new industry classification codes that make women certified small businesses more competitive and more eligible to get access to these government contracts. So this is also about growing businesses during this time through access to markets and not just access to capital. And these things should be happening in tandem. And so the government marketplace is one that is ripe for businesses and is something that SBA is investing considerable amounts of time and attention in supporting access to contracting opportunities across the portfolio of 8A, women-owned certified, veteran certified, HUBZone certified small businesses.
Okay, wonderful. And I'd love to have Fabrice and Luz, if you have thoughts on that same question. What besides financial capital do we need to be working on providing to support this ecosystem as you've both talked about?
Sure, very quickly. I'd just like to add, there are other funds that are available to businesses. Funds launched in 18 states across the U.S. And 15 Southeast states. You have the Southern Opportunity and Resilience Fund. In California, the California Rebuilding Fund, New York, the New York Forward Fund, in Washington State, in Illinois. And these are public-private sector partnerships that are using community development financial institutions to distribute low-interest loans up to $100,000 and technical assistance, business advising, and coaching, which are very, very important for businesses at this time. Many businesses need that advice as much as they need capital, and sometimes even more. And so these partnerships are really leveraging the existing infrastructure of CDFIs, which have deep ties in communities that are most in need and can effectively deploy the capital. They're bringing in loan guarantees from capital sources provided by the SSBCI and the state governments. And then they're bringing in private sector capital. But the most important thing is that small businesses can have access to the technical assistance and the coaching and the advising that they need. So I would encourage those listening to go look for those funds because they are very impactful. And we have seen today over $300 million have been raised. Over 3,500 businesses have been supported, and even more businesses supported with free technical assistance and other support services.
Fantastic. Yes, go right ahead.
I'll just very quickly add here the power of intentionality. Just one example, PayPal last summer committed $100 million to investing in economic advancement for women and girls.
Okay.
And the focus on technical assistance is critical, and also CDFIs are critical there. Intentionality in investing in institutions that focus on these segments is critical to outcomes. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So I really, really appreciate all of our guests being with us here today. Thank you. Again, I feel like we could have talked about this for hours. And so thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Here to discuss breaking the cycle of inaction, progressive prosecutors, police accountability, and public safety, please welcome Keith Ellison, Minnesota Attorney General, and the Atlantic Senior Editor, Ron Brownstein.
Good morning, everybody. Attorney General Ellison, thank you for joining us.
Hello, Ron.
Only on the audio. Good morning. Let me start. Last year, after your office's historic conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George. Hello? Yes? Attorney General Ellison, can you hear me?
Hello, Keith here.
Yes, Attorney General, can you hear me? We seem to be having some technical difficulties on the audio with the Attorney General. Okay, we'll be right back. Hold on, we're just fixing the audio.
I can't hear anything, but I could hear the intro.
And now for a session produced by our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, please welcome Martha McCoy, Executive Director of Everyday Democracy and President of the Paul J. Eicher Foundation, and Bria Gillum, Senior Program Officer, Criminal Justice, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the Atlantic for organizing today's important conversation on advancing equity in America. I'm Bria Gillum, Senior Program Officer at the MacArthur Foundation's Criminal Justice Program, and I'm delighted to be joined in conversation today with Martha McCoy. The MacArthur Foundation's Criminal Justice Initiative is the Safety and Justice Challenge, which is focusing on providing solutions to address mass incarceration in our local jails and eliminate racial and ethnic disparities. We are investing in over 50 local communities across the United States and supporting local solutions to better understand why the country continues to admit over 11 million people in jails annually, and the majority of whom are presumed innocent. Our local jails are also places that are overcrowded, and they tend to house people who often lack adequate housing, who suffer from mental health, addiction, or both, who are poor. And across this country, our local jails are places that disproportionately incarcerate our Black, Latino, and Indigenous people. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be joined in conversation with Martha McCoy, Executive Director of Everyday Democracy and President of the Paul J. Eicher Foundation. Her organization is a grantee of the Safety and Justice Challenge, and their work is helping our local communities drive the transformation process in our criminal justice system. So welcome, Martha. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the work of Everyday Democracy?
Thanks, Bria, and thanks to you all for having us. This is a wonderful opportunity. Our mission at Everyday Democracy, we're a national organization that is dedicated to supporting people and institutions in creating racially just, inclusive communities. And we see that as connected to a vision for a more equitable democracy nationally. And so we work with communities who come to us because they want to build their own capacity to solve problems through an explicit lens of racial equity by bringing people from all walks of life together for community problem solving, for that everydayness of sharing power with one another, understanding structural racism, and then finding very specific ways to make a difference in their institutions and in their community culture to actually support a stronger, thriving community that works for everyone. And that is, as Bria said, we have been working with the Safety and Justice Challenge sites, some of them across the United States for the last few years, helping communities have engagement that's authentic, that helps them make progress on how do they create safety and justice for everyone in their community.
I think, the work that you all have been doing for decades is so important. And as you know, in today's conversation, we're really taking the time to both reflect and assess where we are as a nation. So 2 years since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. In some ways, 2020 really felt like another starting point for this country to really tackle the racial injustice that has plagued this country for centuries. And we saw a lot of new allies join the movement for racial justice. From your standpoint, in 2022, are we still seeing that same energy 2 years later?
Bria, that's a great question because in 2020, we heard from people at an astonishing rate, people who wanted to make a difference, people who saw this as a turning point in the country. And from the narrative we're hearing from traditional media and social media, you might think that energy had subsided. But what we're seeing at Everyday Democracy is that people are committed. There are still growing numbers of people who saw 2020 as a forever turning point in their lives, where they, for the first time, sometimes, especially for white people, understood the depth of the impact of structural racism on our country, on our democracy, who are committed to doing something about it. We also saw increases in multi-ethnic, multiracial commitment to learning about one another's experiences. For example, in the connection between Asian American communities with experiences of growing hate crimes, with Black communities, with Latinx communities, with Indigenous communities, and multiracial commitment to actually reckoning with and dealing with the history of race in our country and trying to do something about it at the local level. But I will also add that the times have changed in the sense that there has been an extreme backlash. There have been increases in hate crimes. There's been increase in disinformation campaigns. There have been out attacks on the teaching of racial history in our schools, so that we see 23 states now with legislation that's actually in some way trying to prevent the teaching of our racial history in schools. And so we have seen some backlash that has really altered the landscape for people in local communities who have been trying to make progress on racial justice. We see that barriers are getting steeper. And so the commitment, the courage that people are showing to actually continue to do this work is really powerful to see. And people are looking for ways to deal with racial equity and racial justice in inclusive ways, because they know there are plenty of people looking for on-ramps into the conversation, into collective action. But there's also pushback to deal with. And so we've seen a variety of ways that local coalitions are dealing with this, and coalitions that are cross-sector and across the grassroots in every region of the country dealing with this dynamic right now.
Yeah, as you know, racial justice work is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And I think what you've been describing is, we've been planting a lot of seeds, building new coalitions that perhaps were not established or were not as strong as we're seeing now. But you also just talked a lot about the pushback and some of the barriers that are continuing to pop up. Public safety is also a huge issue this year for a lot of local elections. So I'm curious, how can we continue to build off of the momentum that you could arguably say restarted in 2020, despite some of this pushback and backlash that you just mentioned?
Yes, I think that what I've described and what you've described, Bria, are the seeds of hope that we see, because we see so many of them around the country. But what we haven't seen is the shift of the discourse in our country. We haven't yet seen that. We haven't yet seen the shift in the narrative. So what I think we will need to attend to, and I think this is the urgency we have as a country, is that we need to be investing in the creation of civic spaces where people of all backgrounds and all generations can really not only improve their racial literacy, but also take that into a sense of reflection and then action. And without investment, that is not going to happen. And I know that there are, for example, the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, is calling for a national trust on civic infrastructure. And I think that this commitment to investing in infrastructure that centers racial justice is really critical to our ability to move forward as a nation. Without the investment, we cannot really counter the energy that has gone into the division that is coming even from mainstream political leaders. And so we're in a very, I would say, a really fierce fight for the inclusive, racially just soul of the nation, that many people are longing to live up to our ideals, but we need to invest in that to make it possible. And I think we're also looking at the need, that's the shifting the discourse, investing in that and making sure it connects to action at the local level. But I think we're also seeing the need to invest in shifting the narrative. And here we're beginning to work with Heather McGee on her, to build off of her book, The Sum of Us, so that people at the local level can start shifting the narrative in their spaces, to say, we need a solidarity dividend. The zero-sum narrative that we have been taught for so long, that
if people of color gain, then white people lose. That has been so embedded in systemically in our institutions and our culture. And so this is a moment, I think, that together we can shift that narrative at the local level, and then working with media who should be covering those stories of what's happening at the local level to claim the solidarity dividend. So I think if we could do both of those things, we could move urgently in our country.
Well, Martha, thank you so much for your time and also just the amazing solutions that you really uplifted in this conversation. I love how you said we're planting the seeds of hope. I really do feel like we are even though we're still in a pandemic and continuing to combat the racial injustices in this country, your organization, and I think the solutions you highlighted of building the infrastructure, working across coalitions is really important to continue to build off the momentum we restarted in 2020. So thank you again for this conversation today.
Thank you, Bria.
With that, I'll turn it back over to the Atlantic.
Here to discuss breaking the cycle of inaction, progressive prosecutors, police accountability, and public safety, please welcome Keith Ellison, Minnesota Attorney General, and the Atlantic Senior Editor, Ron Brownstein.
Good morning again, everybody. Good morning, Attorney General.
Morning, Ron. How are you, sir?
There you. Good. The second time is the charm. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all for persevering through our earlier technical difficulties. Let me just jump right in, Attorney General Ellison. Last year, after your office's conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd, you said, "My hope for our country is that this moment gives us pause and allows us to rededicate ourselves to the real societal change that will move us much further along the road of justice." I'm not talking about the kind of change that will take decades. I'm talking about real, concrete change that real people can make now. Now, almost a year later, where are we?
Well, we've made some progress. We've passed some laws at the state level that are important. We've passed some changes at the municipal level that have been important. We've seen prosecutions and cases that were critical. The Arbery case, the Ahmaud Arbery case is very important to be prosecuted. And even though the results weren't very satisfying in the Breonna Taylor case, there was one person put on trial. They were acquitted, but they did have to face the system, the criminal justice system. And I think there's a growing awareness that we can't have a dual system of justice where some people are permitted to operate with impunity no matter what they do, and other people face the full force of the criminal justice system no matter what they do. And I think there's a growing awareness that that's just not going to work. It breeds a lack of confidence in law and distrust and a whole range of societal problems. But on the other side, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is still not passed. It's still, Congress has not acted. And there remains to be, a lot of progress in that area. So, what I will say is that we have mixed results so far, but we're still committed.
You have said that the kind of change that you're talking about must be a communal effort. In the overall attempt to reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system, who has the biggest lever? Who has the most powerful lever to reduce inequities? Is it prosecutors, legislators, law enforcement, community groups? Where do you see the biggest opportunities for change?
Well, the people with the most power wield it the most slowly. And that's the public. The bottom line is the people with the most power they're not sure what they really want. There seems to be some folks who think that if we move forward on police reform and criminal justice reform, that might jeopardize their safety. That's not true, but there's that belief out there. And there's ambivalence. But when the public decides things have got to be different, things will be different. And it's going to have to be sustained, but the public carries the biggest hammer in the situation. I will say that there's other, well, look, look at it this way. A few months ago, there was a whole spate of stories on certain people in our community calling the police on African Americans when they were doing totally normal things, right? Like bird watching, selling water. Those people make up juries. Those people they vote for legislators. And I guarantee you to one of them, they think of themselves as good people. And if you said that they had racial bias in their hearts, they would adamantly deny it. But still, we got this phenomenon going on where, whether you're going to the pool or bird watching or whatever, somebody might call the police and with tragic results, and they feel that is okay to do. We've got to change that mentality, and which we can do. We've done it. We've changed mentality. I mean, there used to be a time in our country when, telling a racialized joke would be fine. Now it would be a problem. There was a time in our country where people would light up cigarettes, drink while driving. There's all kinds of social behaviors we have changed, and we got to change this, and we can. And this program is part of that, I think.
Well, you alluded to what may be the core political tension in that answer, which is the question of whether public safety, and criminal justice reform, a more equitable system, are in tension. Obviously, we saw a massive outpouring in the public after the murder of George Floyd. Probably the most people in the streets since Kent State in half a century earlier. But last November, voters in Minneapolis rejected the ballot initiative that you supported that would have allowed the police department to be replaced by the Department of Public Safety. We now have recalls underway against progressive DAs in San Francisco and Los Angeles. We've had a pushback on bail reform in New York. Is the movement now on the defensive? And if so, what will it take to regain momentum?
Well, yeah, but let me tell you, the movement for equity and fairness should continually explain to the public why a fairer system is a more effective, safer system for everyone. I mean, the bottom line is, look, so we saw this spike in crime after the murder of George Floyd, but what precipitated the murder of George Floyd other than misconduct, right? Misconduct began the whole problem. If we eliminate this misconduct issue, I believe that you're going to restore trust. You will have better relationships and communication between police and community. You will have better morale among police themselves. And by the way, we've seen a very high number of people applying for disability and PTSD, and policing is hard on police. What we ask them to do is difficult for them. And so I think that we will be better off, and we've got to explain that this is not somebody getting rights at the expense of somebody else. This is all of us living in a safer, more fair environment. That's what we're going for, and that's what these reforms will bring. And of course, there's going to be setbacks.
Sure. Do you think crime rates have to go down to sustain support for reform? Can you pursue reform in an environment where crime rates are going up?
Look, I've stood for election, I would say at least 9 times. And my political sense tells me that it's a lot easier to get reform when crime levels are lower. It's a lot easier, but it's not impossible. I think we've just got to help people understand that where you have an environment of impunity involving armed agents of the state targeting violence toward a discrete and insular group, that reduces trust, therefore reduces communication, and creates an environment where people who would do harm are freer to do it. A self-respecting criminal is like, well, you know what? Because of so much police brutality around here, these people aren't going to call the police on me, so I can just do whatever I want to do. And that's a real thing. And we know that after high-profile incidents of police brutality, 9/11 calls drop. That means that people don't feel that calling the police is going to do them any good. And so, I mean, I think that this issue of trust, it sounds kind of touchy-feely, but it's extremely important. And most law enforcement people will tell you the very same thing.
Well, speaking of trust, I mean, in addition to the conviction of Derek Chauvin, in February, the 3 other former Minneapolis police officers who were with him during Floyd's murder were convicted of federal civil rights offenses.
Yes, they
Why
were.
was it important that these officers were also successfully prosecuted? What effect do you think this will have on the culture in police departments?
Ron, that's an excellent question, because it's too easy to just say Chauvin is one bad apple, right? The conviction of these other three, Tu Tao, Thomas Lane, and Alexander King, what we know now is it's saying that I was just following orders. It's not going to work. I was pretty new on the job. That's not going to work. You went through 18 months of training. You were told to intervene. There were a lot of things you could have done other than tackle Derek Chauvin. You could have just stood up. You could have just got up and say, that's enough, guys. You could have done a million things. And what you did is just went along. You just went along to go along. And it resulted in the death of George Floyd. And it sends an important symbol. I'm hoping that this will change training. It will send a signal to departments all over the country that if you do nothing when something catastrophic and horrible is going on, you could well be held accountable yourself. And by the way, our trial with those three starts June 13th.
I want to ask you about the culture in prosecutor's office now. I mentioned that there are the recalls underway. It's qualified already in San Francisco. They're trying to qualify it in LA against two prosecutors who were elected promising significant change. One thing that's been really striking in both of these cases is how much resistance those new DAs have faced from career prosecutors in their office. In many cases, open resistance, like the association representing the deputy DAs in Los Angeles first suing to block some of George Gascon's policies and then voting to support the recall, openly voting to support the recall of their boss. How would you describe the level of internal support or resistance that you have faced and that you feel that prosecutors in Minnesota face to changing the system along the lines that we've been discussing?
Well, my team has been with me all along. In Minnesota, the Attorney General is sort of the prosecutor of last resort.
Yeah.
If counties need us, they ask us to step in and we do it. And we prosecuted, literally dozens of people in the last several years. And so we're in pretty good stead. But one thing I do, and again, I'm not making any judgments about what those other prosecutors have done, but one thing I do is I make sure that we get the buy-in and people understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, and why, if you don't prosecute criminal conduct when it is performed by a police officer, you set up a dual system of justice, which breeds contempt for law in general. You've got to have an equal system of justice. And guess who wants it more than anybody else? Good police officers. Good police officers don't want to work next to bad police officers. It is hard. It's hard on them when that happens. And so that is, important. So we try to bring them along. But I'll tell you, and one of my good friends who's a prosecutor who's trying to make reform in St. Paul had a very well-known prosecutor in his office under his supervision quit because he thought that prosecutor was too lenient. And so I think that there are some cultural norms within prosecutorial offices too. And my argument is that we shouldn't be tough on crime, nor should we be lenient on crime. We should be effective and fair about crime. That is what we should be. That should be our goal. And and if what you're trying to do is be tough, you're invariably going to charge people you shouldn't charge. You're going to charge them too high, and you're going to let people walk who probably should be prosecuted for committing criminal behavior because they're police officers. So I think that we do need a cultural shift at various stages of the system.
I wonder to what extent there is a kind of a structural or even measurement problem in this debate. The critics and those who are skeptical of the direction that many of these prosecutors, including yourself, want to go, will argue that the sole metric that matters are crime rates and whether or not the DA policies or the Attorney General policies affect the crime rates. I wonder if there is a challenge in measuring the effect of reform, the progress of reform. I mean, it's easy to say you're going to lock someone up for a long time. What is the impact, though, of not trying a juvenile as an adult or not adding sentencing enhancements that keep someone in prison much longer and may allow them to get on with their life in a way that provides more stability to their community and to their family? Is there how do you measure the progress in reform in your mind?
Well, I tell you, Ron, we've got to keep working on how we measure progress because there are a lot of measures. People will select the ones they like. I personally believe the goal has got to be public safety. Public safety. Now, you can use a lot of metrics, clearance rates, the number of prosecutions, the number of years somebody gets. None of those things are very clear indicators of how safe we are. I mean, the bottom line is, you know, we live in community. We want to live quality lives, all of us. We all want to be safe. We have a right to that. And I think that, you know, the metric needs to focus much more on what is the bottom line, a safe community, and also a community in which people feel treated like they're treated equally and fairly. And I think that we're missing on both those counts. We could do a lot better on both. And so I would say that, you know, there's a long way to go. I think that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would set up a national database to help us measure how much excessive force, how much officer involved deaths there are. It would give us a much more clearer picture of racialized stops. And it would also, I think, give us a better grip on how we move forward on officer safety, right? And I mean that because wellness is a part of safety. In Minnesota, we have had a lot of police officers, if you want to count numbers, over 200 who have filed for PSD disability claims because just the job of policing is damaging to their emotional well-being. So that's a metric, you know, and so there are a lot of things to count. But I think at the end of the day, safer community is what it's got to amount to.
You have come back repeatedly to the importance of accountability for law enforcement in the overall picture here. I want to ask you about another high-profile case that has unfolded in Minnesota, which is Kim Potter, as she was sentenced to 2 years in prison after being convicted of manslaughter in the killing of Daunte Wright. Some pushed for you to appeal the sentence, saying it was too lenient. Your office had asked for the presumptive sentence of 7 years, but you did urge the public to accept the decision. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you approached the prosecution and the sentencing for that case?
Well, let me say that we have a grieving family who has lost, you know, the apple of their eye, 20-year-old son gone to them. That is tragic. No parent could withstand that lightly. I mean, that is a tragic incident for the Wright family. But what we analyzed and what we felt is that, you know, we needed to hold her conduct accountable because you cannot shoot people with a Glock, not even knowing that you had a Glock in your hand. And people say it's a mistake. Yes, but we punish mistakes all the time. That's what recklessness is. That's what criminal negligence is, you know. And so, you know, our theory of liability was pretty clear to us. But when it came to sentencing, you know, we felt like, look, does she have a long history of abuse? Answer, no, she had no history. She never even pulled her gun before. Did she demonstrate remorse? She did. Did she, is she one who was known to have a lot of administrative problems and bad relationships with people? No, not really. So we thought that she was kind of a good candidate for a guideline sentence. And that's just the way it is. And so we couldn't, no prosecutor can be an instrument of revenge for the victim. It's not appropriate. You know, you can't do it, you know, and I wasn't about to ask Kim Potter to pay for 400 years of American racism either. We had to judge her based on what she did in this case. And so after the judge gave her a downward departure of 24 months as opposed to the guideline sentence, it was clear to me that was within the court's discretion. I've analyzed, the court's discretion in many, many cases. We've got to prove abuse of discretion in order to mount a successful appeal. And then, of course, if we win the appeal, all we ever win is a resentencing in which the court can go back and make findings and maybe even give a lower sentence, right? So, what the Court of Appeals is going to ask is, were there grounds for the court's decision? And there were in this case. And so we knew that it was not going to be successful. And I can't take up lawyer time like that. Ron?
Yes, I lost you there for a second. Let me ask real quick before we finish. One thing that did come out of this, your office investigated the police use of force here. And I believe now 5 Minnesota counties have agreed to automatically ask your office to investigate police use of force cases. Do you think this should be standard practice across the state, really across the country, to have an outside force?
Well, let me tell you, in the law business, we deal with issues of conflict all the time. If you're in the civil law practice, anytime you pick up a new client, you got to run conflicts, right? You got to, do I have a conflict, right? So it's a very important thing. And so conflicts are important. What is the conflict between the police and the prosecutor when the prosecutor has to look at prosecuting a police officer? We rely on them. They are the ones who investigate the cases. They're ones who run down evidence, talk to witnesses, gather documents. They are key members of the team. And anybody who's ever seen an episode of Law and Order knows that prosecutors and police work together very closely all the time. So you can imagine how a prosecutor prosecuting a police officer might make things awkward, very awkward, extremely awkward, to the point where maybe some people get breaks that they really shouldn't get. Why not just alleviate the conflict and set up alternatives within our state? We have 57 attorneys general across the United States. Most of them, are prosecutors of last resort, like we are. We do a lot of prosecuting because we have 87 counties, but in the original jurisdictions with the county. And so it is good for us to be there to be a backstop. And I think in other states, it might be beneficial to them. I know that it would be helpful. Or if you don't want to give it to the AG's office, you could set up a special office of special prosecution. I know that you've got to create some professional distance in order for these cases to be looked at with some objectivity. And that's not a crack on the prosecutors. Yeah, that's just looking at reality.
Yeah, well, Attorney General,
no, that's just looking at reality.
Yeah, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you for this candid conversation. We'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you also for persevering through our technical gremlins, and go have a good day. Thanks again.
Thank you. Have a good day, Ron.
All right, take care.
And now for a conversation about educational equity for students with disabilities, please welcome Danielle Kovac, special education teacher and president, Council for Exceptional Children, Mercedes Munoz, Oregon 2020 Teacher of the Year and co-administrator of the Hollis School, and Suzanne Stoltz, assistant professor of special education, University of San Diego. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Adam Harris.
Danielle, Mercedes, and Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us. Let's jump right in. So we know that the pandemic has disrupted the education and lives of tens of millions of students, families, and educators across the country, but early evidence indicates a disproportionate effect on students with disabilities, a group of 7 million young people, or 14% of all U.S. students. So can you all speak about your experience over the past 2 years, and where are we now? And Danielle, I'll go to you first for this one.
Sure, absolutely. Well, when we first went virtual because of the pandemic, in my mind, that was an emergency situation where this was something new for education for all of our teachers to have to go virtual at the turn of a switch. So we found that many of our students didn't have laptops, they didn't have access to internet, and most importantly, they didn't have their teachers with them. So for our students with disabilities, there were a lot of hurdles and things that we had to learn, that we had to get through, that in essence, we just weren't prepared to do so. So now coming into the second year, we had a better handle on things. We were able to provide our students with technology, accessible technology for them in order to help them learn. We were able to better prepare our staff. And now that we're in the third year of this, now we're in person more, so we're able to be with our students more. But there were so many lessons learned that now, if this situation comes up again, if we need to go virtual again, we're better prepared for our students and better able to address their individual needs as different situations arise.
And Mercedes, same question to you.
I think that we certainly learned a lot about where there were opportunity gaps for our students, and where we needed to be able to build more of the bridges. I think we were exposed during the pandemic for many things that they were not aware of that our students actually needed. I think, yes, we learned a lot of things about where we could enter the equity fight for students for some. And what I saw was like we had students navigating 6 classes, not having, as was mentioned, the technology, not having access to their individualized programs and support. And over the last 2 years, what I have seen is more of the mental health needs that were exacerbated by the pandemic, and a need for all of the educators to be on top of what signs to look for, and where to provide additional supports.
And as you both mentioned, right, the sort of technology gap, that sort of digital divide became even more ever present during the pandemic. There was a greater awareness of that divide. But I guess what sort of lessons did we learn from remote learning? And Suzanne, I'm going to come to you for this one, but were there any sort of innovative solutions or technology that we can employ going forward to create inclusive environments online and in person?
Yes, a few things that I can think of is that the divide between who has a disability and who doesn't really has kind of gotten blurry because folks have found themselves in really difficult situations. As far as what we've learned a lot about flexibility that hasn't been always afforded. And so we've um, we've gotten different ways um, of giving education. I mean, we've learned to do remote education. Teachers have been challenged to provide instruction in person and online at the same time, which is extremely difficult to do. But I also think that this has opened up a little more communication between schools and families than we've had in the past. And so I see that as one really big benefit of the learning that we've done is that there is more communication between families and schools at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Danielle and Mercedes, just thinking about those kind of different interactions that students and families are having, has that shifted the sort of the pedagogy, right? Just thinking about the pedagogical challenges of remote instruction. What is shifting in your sort of pedagogical methods as you're thinking about both remote and in-person instruction and sort of the hybrid environment that we live in? And
well,
Danielle,
one of the things that sure.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I know that I'm doing now is when I start, even this year, when we started, first thing in school was we learned how to navigate our technology, how to access Google Classroom. If we need to go virtual, here are some tips and tricks. Here's how you get into these things. But a big part of what I've learned as well is that our parents also need assistance in this area. So providing videos for parents on how to help their children at home navigating the virtual world. We all feel that, oh, it's a technology age, or our students are so technology advanced in different areas. And just because they have their iPad or they have their games doesn't necessarily mean that they're proficient in all areas. So it really helped me to realize that I need to instruct my students, help my students, but then also help the parents as well. And now that we have the power of creating videos and, making Google Meets with parents, and I feel like there is a closer connection with parents and getting them more involved in the classroom as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And Mercedes, same question for you.
Thank you, Danielle. I really agree with making things more accessible and teaching students how to use the tools, and also with parents. I think something else that came up for me in my practice was ensuring that we had less ground to cover, if you will. So if we could create some consistency across the Google Classroom, or if we're using Canvas, like, do all of our landing pages look the same? Are some of the links very visible on that first page? And are there tutorials that are available for both students and parents. For some of the learners, particularly who struggle with like executive functioning, asking them to remember that across 8, in a high school setting, 8 periods, right? With 4 classes on the A day and 4 classes on the B day. Sometimes that was certainly too much. And so making sure that there was like a single document where a student could like count for, okay, on my A day, here are all the links, here are the assignments that I need, here's my teacher, and really creating some of those organizational tools so that there could be consistency across classes was very important. And it was a big shift, I think, not only for me personally, but as an instructional coach school-wide, so that our students were having better experiences just across the community.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so you all have, experience training other teachers and who work with students with disabilities. So, along those lines of what you were just saying, Mercedes, what are the most important things you teach other teachers about creating an inclusive environment for their students? And Suzanne, I'm actually going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think a primary thing, although learning the technology is really important, although the different content we teach is important, primary is about relationships and about being able to understand what your students are going through, what families are going through, before you can actually work well together. And I think that is the most primary responsibility and thing that we want our educators to focus on.
Thank you so much. Mercedes, the same question to you.
I agree with the relationship piece. I don't believe that any learning happens without that first being secured and central, is understanding who your learners are and where they're coming from. And definitely during the pandemic, some of the things that I was able to coach teachers about is about the whole child and what is their whole experience outside of the classroom. And people were able to like actually see, okay, like this learner has the responsibility of also taking care of siblings during the day while parents are at work. How is that impacting how they show up? What's the home structure look like? Like not everyone has a private space to do homework. And to be free and clear to turn their camera on. And so a lot of it was just education about different cultural lenses and how to apply that. Also about slowing things down. In certain situations, definitely less was more. How do you go deeper with a specific concept, and then make it real for your students to be able to grab on and then do some exploring? And then also like, are we ready to hear from our learners about what they have to say? They need to be able to give us feedback because they ultimately are the consumer during this time period. And so making room to hear the voices of our students was incredibly, incredibly important. And what things do you listen for that are being said? And then what are some signs, right, that are unspoken? I think many educators around, right, the globe heard silence in those first months, right? Camera off, mic muted. And so we had to be willing to be curious about what are our students telling us and how do we engage them? And what are you willing to try? Because everything was new. And so some of that rigidity of holding on to old practices just wasn't going to work. And so coaching teachers through that and allowing them to explore, okay, what's possible right now? Go and try it. And then let's talk about it and let's see how we can either improve or scrap it all together. And there was a lot of that going on.
Absolutely. In February, the Biden administration stated that they are committed to ensuring that children with disabilities continue to receive the services and support that they need so that they can reach their highest potential. And Danielle, I know you testified on Capitol Hill about some of the policy priorities that are most important to reaching that goal. So what are some of those policy priorities that are most imperative to reaching that goal of ensuring that children with disabilities receive the services and support that they need?
Absolutely. So Congress has had an opportunity for almost 47 years to fully fund the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that is the law that gives our students with disabilities everything they need, a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. But part of that law is that our schools get 40% of what they're spending for our students with disabilities. So it's important to know that this has not yet been fully funded. And 47 years is entirely too long to have a law for our students and to not have it funded. So the first step is to really look towards funding IDEA and making sure that our students are getting everything they need in a public setting that they're afforded to help them learn, and to make sure that we're breaking down that divide, that they are inclusive, that they're getting what they need, and that we need money to support that. And that funding, that law is there. We just need the money behind it.
Absolutely. And beyond some of the educational markers, the pandemic had a huge impact on students' mental, emotional, and social health and development. So how can we address that and bring students back into the sort of campus community? And Suzanne, I'm going to go to you first with that.
Okay, so I think this is really a huge issue right now. So a lot of students have experienced traumatic things during the pandemic, losses of family members, disconnect from the social life that they had previously had, disruption of their routines. And so coming back into school is not easy at that point. And so I think we have to be really thoughtful about how educators are responding to the needs and the behaviors that come along with that. And so we have to be really thoughtful. We have to be careful to not move into suspending and expelling students. That is an issue even in non-pandemic times. So I think we have to really really work on our trauma-informed practices and really be responsive as students come in with the various needs that they have. So I think that is a priority.
Absolutely. And speaking about those sort of compounding issues, while all students with disabilities have faced particular challenges during the pandemic, the students who perhaps most negatively have been impacted are those who are sort of at the intersection of disability and other marginalized communities. So how can we sort of prioritize those students to prevent long-term inequity? And Mercedes, I'll start with you on this.
I think it's really hard work to continue disrupting a system that has established itself on really sorting kids into categories. And I think that as educators and advocates, we do have to carry a strong inherent belief that all children are capable, all children are abundant, all children are brilliant and creative. And then it becomes our task to find the pathways, right, that allow that abundance, that brilliance, and that creativity to emerge. And it is not a cookie cutter thing by any means, right? What works for one student on one day at this time is not going to work for another. And I think that is the part of like the individualized education plan. It is the driver of everything that I, as a special educator, am to do. And I agree with the funding piece. If I have 43 students on my caseload, and am required to do all of the paperwork, write all of the plans, collect all of the data, meet with them individually, provide all of the instruction, and I don't even have paraeducator support or the time allotted to be able to really give the students what they need, then I think that the advocacy piece and continuing to, like I say, knock down the door, right? So that people hear, listen, we cannot continue to think that we are going to have a fully inclusive society if we are putting children into silos. And so with the intersectionality piece, a lot of times some of that looks like educating parents who get a pamphlet like that says, here are your procedural safeguards and here are some of the rights that are afforded to you, and they don't understand it. It's being able to have that time to educate our families, educate other educators on how they can be advocates and proponents in the classroom. And I just think it takes a cross section of all of us, all of our voices amplified on behalf of our youth and our students, and understanding who gets routed into special education first. Oftentimes it is our Black, Brown, and Indigenous youth for behaviors that we don't readily identify in our white students and counterparts, and understanding that we have got to do some changes in even who is being placed in special education and how we're going about doing the screenings for that. So that's a lot to chew on, but those are some of my thoughts.
Absolutely. And Danielle or Suzanne, anything to add there?
Yes, I think the biggest thing is we need to be aware of our students. We need to be aware of their differences and how we as educators can focus on what our students need in order to be successful. And I think above all, we need to make sure that our students are always in a place where they know they are safe, they are loved, they are cared for, and we are here for them to help them succeed. And especially for our students with disabilities and for our students from, different areas of the community. You are here, you are part of us, you are welcome. Even if it's something as simple as, I've got a crayon color that matches your skin type that you can color so it looks like you. I've got books on all different cultural backgrounds that you can relate to. And you are in a place where this is your home and we are your family. So I think it's important to be aware of our students and of their cultural differences and make them know that they are welcomed and they are valued.
And Suzanne.
I would just add, as I listen to Mercedes speak about what educators are stepping up to do and this lack of resources, that I want to just give a little attention to what educators are doing and how very difficult this job is, and that they also have undergone a lot of really difficult situations. We have a shortage of teachers. We have a shortage of special education teachers. And until we get some of that funding, until we shift our priorities, we're going to have a harder time retaining teachers who can do this important work. So working with teachers, thinking about what their needs are as well, is crucial here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This is an incredibly important topic, and we could discuss it all day, but we'll have to leave it there for now. Danielle, Mercedes, and Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Here to discuss innovative solutions to advance health equity, please welcome Philip Alberti, Founding Director, AAMC Center for Health Justice, Aletha Maybank, Chief Health Equity Officer and SVP, the American Medical Association, with Atlantic staff writer, Catherine Wu.
Dr. Maybank, Dr. Alberti, thank you so much for joining us, and we can jump right in here. So, Dr. Maybank, you are the Chief Health Equity Officer and Senior Vice President of the American Medical Association. Dr. Alberti, you're the Founding Director for the Center for Health Justice at the Association of American Medical Colleges. I'd like to ask both of you what the role is of these two professional organizations in the health equity movement. Dr. Alberti, we'll start with you.
Sure, thank you so much. At the AAMC Center for Health Justice, we frame health justice in this way: one foot grounded in community wisdom and multi-sector partnerships, the other foot solidly in a research to action imperative. And we walk with both of those feet down the road towards health justice in a very explicit, anti-discriminatory and anti-racist way, making sure we are focused on unjust, avoidable, systematic differences in health between groups. And so we see the role of our center really threefold. One, to model what it means for our member medical schools and teaching hospitals, as well as other national organizations, to walk that health justice walk. We try to influence the ways in which our, again, members and constituents and other organizations and federal partners and funders commit to community engagement, to really centering community wisdom in our efforts to achieve health equity and social justice. And we try to ease the path by developing tools and resources that will allow our organization, our member organizations, their community partners, and again, our federal partners and funders to really begin to do this work in a more authentic, deeper, and committed way, understanding that those closest to injustice are those closest to solutions to the injustice. And therefore, we see that as our main charge.
Thank you. Dr. Maybank.
Thanks, and great being here, great being on the panel with Dr. Alberti as well. The Center for Health Equity is now about almost 3 years old that I've been in this position. And it really was a calling upon the American Medical Association and its House of Delegates. The American Medical Association has been around since 1847 and has a little over 270,000 members. And they have been very critical, and the AMA has been very well known for having a strong position in place in advocacy in this country as it relates to health care, but also a lot of influence in what happens beyond just its membership and in medicine overall. And so the House of Delegates really came together and said, AMA, knowing its history also of exclusion and injustice over its years, said we need to step into this space more intentionally around embedding equity in all that we do across the work of the AMA that impacts not only membership, but realizes it impacts medicine as well. And so the recommendation 3 years ago was to have a Center for Health Equity, an organizational unit, and a leader of that unit. And our role is really to help facilitate a process to embed equity across all functions. So whether it's performance or operations or data, publications, communications, all of that we have a role in. Now, we don't do it all of ourselves because that would be tiring and taxing, but we do have a team, and we've provided resources to build out a team to help support doing that. Last May, we released our strategic plan to advance equity, and specifically, especially in the space of racial equity, not to the exclusion of other forms of equity that we know are really important to drive as well at the intersections. But our plan really put forward, I think, in a really bold way that medicine, and I think even surprising for many folks for the AMA to put forward in a bold way, some strategies. And one is saying that, in order for us to really step into this space of race and justice and, dismantling racism and justice and health and equity, we have to look at what we're doing internally. We have to understand, how we show up. What are the mental models of how we make decisions within the AMA that may actually exacerbate inequities that exist? And so there's an inside-outside approach to doing this work. A second part is how do we, and Dr. Alberti elevated lots of this, and how do we engage and build alliances and share power in different types of ways and not be top down in the way that many of our historically white institutions have been in this country for generations and still even at this point in time. The other part is how do we get and help support the healthcare community to really better understand this larger context of what creates health beyond just what happens within the health walls and the hospital walls, but what's happening in their environment with housing and education and all of these upstream opportunities that we know impact health. And then the root causes and the isms, the racism and white supremacy and sexism and ableism, and how all those lenses actually drive how policy is created in this country. Our fourth approach is around ensuring equitable opportunities in innovation, understanding that oftentimes that's a very exclusive space, and oftentimes women and people of color don't have opportunities within those spaces. So what can we help to do? And then lastly, which I think is really near and dear to my heart, is how are we fostering pathways for truth, racial healing, and reconciliation for our past that we have to acknowledge in ways that we've created harm. And again, AMA not being the only institution that has that type of relationship, but really calling out that in order to really heal, we have to recognize and honor and recognize and do something differently about the harm that we have caused.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that overview. So, you both really centered community engagement efforts in both of your overviews just now. I wonder if you can each highlight some of the examples of successful collaborations with community partners and what sort of template these partnerships can offer for future health equity efforts. Dr. Alberti, I'll start with you again.
Sure, great, thank you. One of the things that I always say is that community engagement isn't a thing that you do on the weekends. It's how you do all the things. It's really a process. It's a practice. It's how we show up as partners in and with our communities. It's how we demonstrate our trustworthiness as organizations and as individuals, how we build bi-directional communication channels, and how we can ensure the sustainability of any interventions or policy or practice shifts because they are grounded in that community wisdom and expertise. So I'll offer up two quick examples of what that might look like on the ground. So from a hyper-local level, I was serving in a panel last year with a woman named Gina Green Harris from the University of Wisconsin Center for Community Engagement and Health Partnerships at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. And I'll abridge the story she told. So it went something like this. When they started the center, obviously an outcome of import to the university was the diversification of clinical trials, important for all the reasons that we know in terms of making sure that our innovations are actually generalizable to the most diverse set of communities possible. But Gina and team had a sense, well, that might not be what's most important to our community. So I'm not going to lead with that. We're going to spend some time breaking bread, understanding what our community-based and faith-based organizations are, what assets they provide, what fears they have about collaborating with our institution, what their goals are from any partnerships. And so they did that work of bread breaking and relationship building for 2, 3, 4 years without mentioning clinical trials until one day, the community members actually came to Gina and her team and said, hey, we're curious. Why aren't you asking us about participating in clinical trials? We are eager, we're excited, we trust you, we're willing to do this. And so that really broke the seal. And to hear her tell it, the enrollment of diverse participants in the trials that were underway just ballooned and skyrocketed. So I think that really speaks to the long arc of engagement, the work that it takes, the maintenance and nurturing of those relationships to make sure that everyone is benefiting and that it's not really transactional and extracting something that the institution with power and privilege needs. And then I'll just say one last quick thing. Even a national organization like Dr. Maybank's and like the AAMC's can walk this talk as well. So when we released our principles for trustworthiness just about a year ago, which is a set of core tenets that any organization of any kind can take to demonstrate they are worthy of a community's trust, that entire toolkit was truly co-developed, not just by the center staff or by the center plus our members of our collaborative for health equity that we work with, but also by the 30 or 35 community members from 7 different geographies across the US, all 50 of us, extracting themes, editing the video, extracting the principles, making sure that the voice was authentically the communities and not the AMC coming from our ivory tower, presenting our best ideas, but making sure we were truly centering that community wisdom. So 2 quick examples.
Fantastic. Dr. Maybank, I'd love to hear some examples from you as well.
Absolutely. Really great to hear that too, Dr. Alberti, and hear your work. So I'll provide 2 examples kind of in a very similar way. When I came on board, one of our key goals as the AMA was to help support physicians and healthcare systems to better support their patients in high blood pressure control, and specifically with an outcome of focusing on Black patients across the country. We know what the data shows in terms of the inequities that exist. And we understand also the systems and structures that set up to produce that for patients as well. And we wanted to do an opportunity that actually focused on engaging physicians, because that's our audience, but in a not a top-down way. So we have partners. There are already leaders of physicians of color within this country. And there was already work happening with the American Heart Association around this work. And so, our idea and intention was, well, let's come together. And let's come together in a way, though, that it's not saying like AMA gets to dictate all that happens with this, even if we are a key funding partner or the main funding partner, the same with AHA. Let's partner and ask NMA if this would be of interest of them. NMA is the National Medical Association. It was actually created and almost in a way forced to create because Black physicians were excluded from AMA for a very long time, up until the Civil Rights Act was passed formally. And so NMA came on board. We also asked the Association of Black Cardiologists, as well as the Minority Health Institute. And so we have created a coalition now to help inform a program that we have called Release the Pressure. We don't even brand the program with any of our logos. It is just Release the Pressure. And we've been working with some lead partners in branding across the country, Essence and Afropunk and Ebony.com to really deliver and connect the message in very unique ways. And I think if we as AMA did this on our own, we wouldn't have gotten to that point and be able to do that level of community engagement. And then also in order to ensure that we are accountable to our principles around equity, we have an outside entity that actually brings us together, communicates with us on a consistent basis to make sure that these decisions are actually shared. And again, we are not coming in to say this is how it has to happen and needs to happen. That's how things typically happen and have happened in the past. And then the other part that I think is really critical to this point of engagement. Recently I heard Abigail Echohawk, who is director of the Indian Health Urban Institute, talk and, saying, that, historically colonized and institutionally underserved individuals in this country and communities have ideas already. They've been creating, they've been innovating, they have put forward solutions for programs and policies and initiatives. We just need to engage with those entities and work to elevate and fund their ideas. I don't even elevate, it's more exposed, because I think the ideas are fantastic. And so how can we use our power and position as AMA and other large institutions to really provide that space who engages with healthcare systems across the country to really expose these wonderful things that are already happening. This is Black Maternal Health Week, right? And thanks to Black Mamas Matter and the National Birth Equity Collaborative led by Dr. Joy Carrere-Perry, they have a model for respectful maternity care and healthcare. Our role could be, as AMA should be and will be, is to expose that to many folks across the country that we have relationships with. There's work up in Boston by Doctors Michelle Morse and Doctors Bram Wispelwey at Brigham's, and they've used data to show how white patients are more likely to get increased level of cardiac care. So they developed a model called the healing arc, and really focused again on how do you repair the harm that's done at the institutional level. Another great model that's already existing that we have the opportunity to kind of expose and engage with communities in that way. And so later this year, we'll be launching an initiative that kind of does that, of one, bringing together the ecosystem in that way, increasing knowledge and skills, but also igniting collective mobilizing for structural changes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So my next question is more on the access side. So, especially during the past couple of years, a lot of initiatives have had to go virtual, including, the expansion of telemedicine, which has really expanded access to care. But it certainly also raises some questions about how, accessible tools can be implemented equitably. How can we ensure that tools like telemedicine are going to be available to everyone who needs them instead of further widening disparities along, technological lines? And sorry, Dr. Mabeck, I'll start with you here.
Okay, no problem. So I think, definitely clear about what the COVID-19 really led to the complete paradigm shift towards telehealth and remote patient care. And the data showing the majority of patients and physicians and healthcare providers, they want to continue with this type of care and this opportunity. But it also showed, it's interesting, from the patient perspective, they didn't have much experience with it. And from the healthcare provider perspective, they didn't have much experience with it either. And so I think where we're going towards and heading towards is exactly right, is that we have to keep this lens on how do we ensure we're implementing an equity lens? And folks need to understand really fully, what that means. And I always think about Kamara Jones and her work around, if something doesn't show that we are not valuing people equally, and that will show up in our data, then we need to always keep lens and focus on the inequities and the disparities that are happening. We need to make sure we're paying attention to the data in terms of what's happening with our patients over time. We cannot make the assumptions that just because the service is there, that it has been taken up in a way that is useful for the patient and that is useful for the healthcare provider as well. We have passed policy as AMA that recognizes broadband internet as a social determinant of health. And so, again, I think it's our collective responsibility to really monitor the access to and the policies as it relates to telehealth equity. We just released a primer on opportunities for healthcare in terms of telehealth equity, and some of them include just making sure that we're continuing to support and advocate for funding that focuses on broadband, especially for marginalized and historically marginalized communities, and not to give that pressure up. That needs to happen continually across the country, because I could see that kind of going off the radar a little bit, but also advocating from a design perspective, making sure that when design is happening for functionality, for user interface, that historically marginalized communities are also part of those conversations and that development and that design, and they're getting paid for it as well. And we're not exploiting people in that process. I think when I think about equity, it's a lot about, what we were talking about before. Who has the power to make the decision, to create, to design, to distribute, and then also to redistribute resources to where they are most in need. And that is the focus that we are going to need to have as it relates to telehealth moving forward.
Great. Dr. Alberti, same question.
Sure. Just to build a little bit on what Dr. Maybank said. So in terms of resources, the AAMC has released some competencies around telehealth that specifically include and center equity and how we ensure access to telehealth as part of physician and care team competencies. And not to sound like a broken record, I think the theme of this Q&A is certainly community engagement. I think that's really the key, is how do we engage from the very beginning communities, patients, and families, so we can ensure the kinds of healthcare equity access that we're talking about. I think too often we do the engagement after the innovation. Right? That's precisely the wrong order of operation. Right? And so what do you see when we look to the literature right now? If you were to look for access to telemedicine over the course of the pandemic, you would find study after study saying not all communities across the US had access and were able to utilize telemedicine fully. So that might be older Americans, it might be folks in rural communities, it might be certain racial and ethnic minority groups, the uninsured or the underinsured. And that really points to exactly what Dr. Maybank said, making sure that all communities, that we are doing that engagement, that we are co-designing the appropriate workflows, processes, care teams that can really ensure access, because access isn't the same as utilization. So I think part of that is thinking through what are the barriers for specific communities. It might be digital literacy, it might be language, it might be accessibility, it might be broadband access, as the AMA is focused on. It might be, fears that we all have about sharing personal, medical, social data information over a Zoom platform with a relative stranger. So I think, there's this imperative to partner with communities and families and to understand that there are going to be differences in barriers between communities, and there are also going to be differences in barriers within communities. Our neighborhoods, our populations that we serve are not monolithic. And so that kind of really deep, authentic, meaningful engagement where we are prioritizing as task number one, that kind of identification of potential barriers and facilitators that promote healthcare opportunity. I think that's really where we have to start.
Fantastic. And that, can I just add to that really quick too? Because I think that's possible if me a conversation. I think what also is really critical to doing that is, and you have to name it because oftentimes it's assumed and that it just happens. And I think, Dr. Alberti and I are in good situations where we have leadership, we're leaders, but we also have leadership that shows up and says that this needs to happen. And the leaders are held accountable to that. And oftentimes what structures of kind of engagement and community engagement allows is a mechanism for accountability in a way that institutions may not have had before. And because my feeling is, I'll hear folks say, yes, that's right, this is great, that's the way it should go, but the action isn't there to support it. And I feel oftentimes the accountability isn't there on the part of leadership, but the accountability isn't there in part of the engagement piece. So in doing this equity work, and as we drive forward and people are building solutions at their institutions, they have to build in accountability metrics. How are they, metrics, literal metrics and data, but also processes that help support really driving equity forward.
Thank you so much for that addition. And I think we will actually have to leave it there for now, though I wish we could continue the conversation. Dr. Maybank, Dr. Alberti, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For our final conversation exploring the future of women in the workforce, please welcome Wendy Chun-Hoon, Director, Women's Bureau, Department of Labor. Back again to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Annie Lowry.
Thank you so very much. So I'm delighted to be here with you, Wendy, and I want to go ahead and jump right in. So you joined the administration at the point when women's participation in the workforce was at its lowest level in a generation. And so I'm wondering if you could just give us a preface on where we are right now, that we've ricocheted from this economy that was basically frozen in place to this economy where now we have a relatively low unemployment rate. We're seeing people come back into the workforce. We're seeing wage gains, though, of course, we are also seeing things like issues with inflation and perhaps even labor shortages. So I'm hoping you could give us your view from Washington.
Yeah, thanks, Annie, for having me here today. Yeah, you said it. The economy's definitely been improving. Unemployment has gone down. But women, just to keep the focus on what we are seeing, women have recovered more slowly than men. Still 2 years later, or 2 years into the pandemic, we've got 1 million fewer women in the labor force. And I just, need to say the impact of job losses hasn't been the same for all women. We see Black women's unemployment recovering the least. So really keeping a sharp focus on that and understanding that the reason why we've seen such negative employment effects for women as opposed to men is because women have been concentrated in some of the lowest paying jobs in our economy. This is a pattern, I would call it, that's called, occupational segregation, which is really just this very highly sort of gender division between men and women into different types of jobs. And that in part is what drives things like the gender wage gap, because these jobs are devalued. And what happened during the pandemic, because we've long known that, is that women were overrepresented, have been overrepresented in the occupations and industries that experience the greatest job losses. So jobs like care jobs and health and education and retail and hospitality. So we are still very much making our way back in that area. And also, we all experience this. I have young kids at home, but the pandemic really created this caregiving crisis for so many families. So still coming back from the fact that, nearly all the employment losses were among moms that had kids under the age of 13. We're looking at, still most recent data. This is just a few months ago. You've got 5 million women who are living in households with kids under 5 who weren't able to attend, regular daycare or childcare arrangements in the past couple of weeks. We're still looking at childcare and elder care workforces that are down, roughly 10% from pre-pandemic. So just state of play is improving, but we have to really keep that laser focus on who is still bearing the cost of the pandemic.
Okay. And do you think that the shift that you're seeing, where in some cases women, in particular Black women, and it seems like women who were working in low wage occupations beforehand are having a harder time rebounding, is that an artifact of how much worse the recession was for them? Or are there sort of specific structural elements that you would point to that might be holding them back, or some mix of both of those things?
I think it's all of that. I think that, yes, the concentration of women and women of color into, as I was saying earlier, some of the lowest paying jobs in the economy. They're also all of the jobs that we count on to go to work for those of us who have caregiving responsibilities. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. I sort of said it as I was saying, who's still bearing the cost? But the Department of Labor just issued a report last month that sort of aggregated what it actually costs that our economy is structured in this way that devalues women's work and also undervalues or underinvests in the care infrastructure that we need. The report is actually called Bearing the Cost, and it aggregated the impact that these conditions have on specifically women of color, where Black women have lost out on an annual basis in the amount of something like $39 billion. Hispanic women losing out on better than $46 billion in just 1 year in terms of the lower wages paid compared to their white male counterparts. And so all of that together, all taken together, we're seeing ways in which we really have to restructure how we value work, how we support folks in getting to work, specifically women of color, and the impact that has on our economy, our regional economies, our national economy. And so really taking that comprehensive approach as we're designing strategies as we're coming out of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk me through what you imagine the longer range impacts of this might be, perhaps from what we know from past recessions or either other pandemics or other sort of shifts in the economy that other countries might have seen. What do we think that this trouble that women, Black women, Latino women are having might have, 10 or 20 years down the road?
I think in some regards, we've hit rock bottom and the only place to go is up. I think we know how to structure a more inclusive and equitable recovery. Things like making sure that we're sort of fighting back on this notion of occupational segregation that I was talking about earlier, where, from very young ages, we sort of channel women, young girls into certain types of occupations. But really actually taking concrete measures to support women entering some of the higher paying jobs that are getting created now in the economy, which are historically more male dominated jobs. Making sure that we are raising wages, raising job quality standards in the very more traditional female oriented or female dominated jobs in the economy. And then making sure that the jobs that we are creating are really quality jobs. So all of those are concrete ways that we can address what have been longstanding barriers to fixing the gender and racial wage gap that women and specifically women of color face. All of those are right at our fingertips in terms of the investments that certainly this administration, this Congress have made that are making their way into the states right now, and all of which will, really, as we like to say, flip the script on the inequity that we've seen longstanding, and now's the time to make those changes.
Got it. So I'm wondering if you can talk me through the childcare piece of this, because I know even in my own community, and I have little kids too, there was a tremendous shortage of childcare spots during the pandemic as centers closed for health reasons. And even now, it seems that there's still a shortage of shortage of spots, and especially affordable spots for families. And that might be one thing that's holding young parents in particular back from re-entering the workforce. How much progress have we made since the pandemic, or how much is this a space that's going to need some kind of social repair going forward?
Yeah, great question. Great way to underscore. I was surprised. I said this earlier, but I will say it again, that even as a couple of months ago, there were 5 million women living in households where their kids' daycare, childcare support was upended and they weren't able to access it. That's quite a few households. And of course, that has an impact on women's labor force participation, regional economies. I also mentioned that we are still down roughly 10% in both home care and elder care support systems and workforces. So we've got room we've got room and urgency to turn this around. But what some positive signs we're seeing what states have done with the American Rescue Plan funds. They are really taking a comprehensive look and an immediate look at how to increase access, increase affordability, make sure that childcare providers, for example, are okay and supported through this pandemic. And can maintain sustainable availability and open hours, but also really importantly, that third leg of the pillar, making sure that the workforce, for example, our childcare workers are being paid a wage that is sustainable for their own households. This is a highly female workforce, as I mentioned earlier, very much women of color in these jobs, and they stand up the rest of the economy. So we've got to make sure that that third pillar is part of the equation. So I think we're seeing states doing the right thing, really responding, and a lot of room to grow that, and hopefully a very heightened conversation about increased resources at the national level to do that.
I was wondering if you could talk me through what we might know about the child tax credits effect on this situation. So there is this policy which many Democrats in Congress and I believe the White House are hoping to restore, of direct payments to the parents of young kids. Most households with children in the United States got the money, which might have, it seems like, affected the demand side for childcare. But as you point out, there's also that supply side constraint. So I'm wondering what we know about how that might have affected the labor market, although of course it's very soon after this policy was in place and then expired for us to be talking about it. So maybe even perhaps what you would be watching.
I actually think in this area, the data is pretty clear. I mean, policies like child tax credit, earned income tax credit have been on the books. States have been experimenting with them. Congress has taken action on them for years now. And, the positive effects on stabilizing family income are really clear, apparent. It's probably why they're so popular in terms of the policy. And so, I think enacting those in a moment of, need for economic aid at the family level, at the regional economy level was really smart, very responsive. And as we saw, a lot of take up of those really just to hold the line, right? For families' budgets to hold the line, to make sure that families could get by. So I think that they are effective. They were quick to pass because they're known as being effective in terms of an income support. And, we're still in this pandemic. We are still very much in recovery. And so these are really important levers at this time.
So you've been an advocate for paid leave programs, and I'm wondering if you would talk me through where we are with the effort to have a national paid leave and family medical leave program, given that right now we obviously have the pandemic policies, and then we have kind of a patchwork of policies depending on who you are in the labor market and what state you're in. But setting that national level policy, if you could talk through the importance of that and kind of where we are with that.
Great question. If there were ever a time to really recognize the need and I would say the significant absence of policies like paid family medical leave, like paid sick and safe days, it's in a pandemic. I live in the state of Maryland, so the whole state is sort of celebrating the passage of the paid family medical leave here that just happened late last week, over the weekend. And so states have been, marching very deliberately towards these very equitable, effective models that really create a track record for what the country can do if we address it at a national and sustainable level. So I think, again, during some of the COVID response packages that Congress passed, there was a lot of attention on making sure that there were those solutions as part of the package, making sure that people could access paid sick days, for example, and the places, the evidence that was coming out of the cities and states in terms of their transmission levels for the pandemic, in terms of supporting workers to get back to work if they had to be out because they were sick or a family member was sick, was really effective. So back to that question you asked about the child tax credit and earned income tax credit, these are effective solutions that prove so in the depths of the pandemic. And I think they create a lot of evidence for what we can do, what we must do going forward.
Okay, wonderful. So just have one final question, which is, when we're thinking about creating workplaces that are free of the kind of discrimination that you've been gesturing to, or where we're closing the gender pay gap, obviously the economy itself and the economic pressures for wage growth in the economy are going to have some role in that. But I'm wondering if you can talk through what you think of as the administration's role in starting to tackle that going forward, or continuing to tackle it going forward.
Absolutely. I think at sort of a individual worker or workplace scenario, and the point I made earlier about how important it is to make sure that we're able to choose our careers based on our interests and not based on our gender, and really addressing this issue about occupational segregation and supporting women to get into the jobs that are going to be created to rebuild the infrastructure of our country. They're entering into a workplace where you are by far the minority is going to take a lot of attention to make sure that that workplace is really free from harassment and discrimination and bullying. We're just at the White House really marking what we like to do a sprint to really think through, for example, jobs in the supply chain, trucking jobs. These can be good jobs. Women can enter these jobs, but they need to absolutely be free from harassment and discrimination. So I think attention on the strategies when women are entering into what are non-traditional occupations is going to be really key. What the White House, this administration, certainly the Department of Labor are doing at a really whole of government level is working through the Gender Policy Council on two really important interventions. One is the gender equity strategy. All of our agencies across the federal government are right now identifying the important interventions that we can make. Another significant whole of government plan is the National Action Plan to address gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, or I should say everywhere, including in the world of work when I put a Department of Labor hat on, and really bringing all the power of the federal government behind these solutions, and really figuring out how to really intervene in this moment when there's so much growth, so much dynamism, and so much opportunity to really level the playing field.
Fantastic. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much, Wendy. And I'm going to pass the moderating hat back over to my colleague, Candace.
Thank you so much. We hope today's program was a valuable experience for you. Please take a moment to share your thoughts with us by completing our survey. Your input is very important to helping us shape future programming for Atlantic Live. You can find a link to complete the survey in the chat. You'll also receive a link directly to your inbox following the conclusion of today's broadcast. Thank you again to all of our speakers and to our underwriter, the MacArthur Foundation, for their support of the Atlantic's journalism today. Also, I want to remind everyone that virtual registration for our In Pursuit of Happiness event is still open. Please visit the Atlantic Live website to see the agenda, speakers, and to register. You do not want to miss it. If you would like to stick around to virtually network with other attendees, you can do so by clicking the networking button on the left side of your screen. Also, we've assembled a toolkit of resources to deepen our understanding of the bold measures needed to enact systemic changes. This toolkit can be found in the Explore section in the Atlantic booth. Thanks again for joining us today.